In 1989, Japan stood at the peak of economic power. The value of land in Tokyo alone surpassed the total real estate assets of the entire United States. The world looked at Japan with a mixture of awe and fear, believing they were about to dominate the global economy. But within just a few short years, everything vanished. Stocks fell by half, real estate evaporated by 80%, millions lost their life savings. The question is, was this an economic accident or a carefully calculated geopolitical chess move? Welcome to the Global Lens, where we dissect the power plays that shape our world. This video isn't just about Japan's past. It's a roadmap to help you read the hidden language of financial geopolitics, understand how superpowers protect their positions, and more importantly, learn how to protect your own assets when the game changes its rules. Because in this world, the most dangerous strikes don't come from warfare, but from agreements signed in silence. On May 22, 1985, 5 men sat together at the Plaza Hotel in New York. No reporters, no official announcements, just a closed-door meeting. But what they decided in that conference room reshaped Japan's economy for the next 3 decades. This wasn't an ordinary diplomatic gathering. This was the moment when financial power revealed its true nature, when a nation felt its position threatened and decided to rewrite the rules of the game. To understand why Japan became the target, we need to go back to 1945. Tokyo at that time was a field of ruins. 66 cities were carpet-bombed, the industrial system was nearly paralyzed, people lived in hunger and desperation. But from those ashes, a long-term strategy took shape, later known as the Yoshida Doctrine. The deal was extremely simple but bold. Japan handed over all national defense to the United States, spending nothing on the military. In return, they poured every resource into a single objective, building economic strength. While America spent billions on the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, Japan quietly built the world's most sophisticated manufacturing machine. They didn't invent new technologies, but they turned technology into perfect products. Affordable prices, superior quality. From the 1960s, Japan's economy grew 10% annually. By the early 1980s, they didn't just catch up with the West, they surpassed it. In 1980, Japan became the world's largest automobile producer, overtaking the United States. For America, this wasn't just a statistic. This was a real psychological shock as Toyota, Honda, and Nissan flooded parking lots from Kansas to Ohio. American consumers used their own money to buy Japanese products, from cars to Nintendo game consoles. By 1985, America's merchandise trade deficit reached a record $148.5 billion, with Japan alone accounting for $50 billion. The problem wasn't just that Japan was too good. America also faced a strong dollar, persistent budget deficits, and political pressure from voters witnessing factories close and jobs disappear. The concept of the Rust Belt began to emerge. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, auto factories in Detroit shut down in waves. Tens of thousands of workers lost jobs. Unemployment rates in industrial towns hit 20%. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Economic competition morphed into racial hatred. In July 1987, U.S. lawmakers smashed a Toshiba radio in front of cameras as a symbolic message. In Detroit, 2 auto workers beat a Chinese-American man to death, mistaking him for Japanese. President Reagan faced enormous pressure from Democrats, who were preparing to impose tariffs up to 100% on Japanese goods. Reagan, a believer in free markets, needed to find a way to restrain Japan without destroying the entire global trading system. He assigned the task to Treasury Secretary James Baker. Baker realized Japan's strength came not only from technology or manufacturing, but from its exchange rate. At that time, the Japanese yen was at an extremely favorable level for exports, around 240 yen to $1. This made Japanese goods significantly cheaper than American goods, while profits converted to local currency remained very attractive. Baker's plan was simple but ruthless: force the yen to appreciate sharply, making Japanese goods more expensive in the U.S. market. But to execute this, he needed cooperation from major economies, and most importantly, Japan had to agree. In the summer of 1985, Baker sent top-secret invitations to G5 finance ministers, including West Germany, France, Britain, and Japan. The meeting was kept extremely secret to avoid alerting speculators. Japanese Finance Minister Noboru Takeshita had to use sophisticated tactics to attend secretly. That morning, he deliberately appeared in Tokyo playing golf to divert media attention, then immediately went to Narita Airport to catch a commercial flight to the U.S. When he arrived in New York, he believed he was there to salvage the alliance by agreeing to a moderate yen appreciation, around 10 to 20%. He had no idea he was walking into a trap designed to devastate his homeland's economy. The meeting took place on Sunday morning in a closed conference room. Baker laid out the terms to representatives of economies accounting for half of global output. After hours of discussion, they signed the Plaza Accord, a brief statement asserting that orderly appreciation of currencies against the U.S. dollar was necessary. The remarkable thing about the Plaza Accord is that it didn't need to be lengthy. Just a simple statement from the world's largest economies was enough for the market to understand that governments would act together to weaken the dollar. In finance, markets don't wait for official policy. Just believing governments were about to act, speculators moved quickly, and when enough people believed, they turned the prediction into reality. It should be clarified that the Plaza Accord wasn't aimed solely at Japan. It was a coordinated effort among major powers to bring the dollar to a more favorable level. But within that overall picture, Japan suffered the biggest shock because its growth model depended heavily on exports to the U.S. market. On Monday morning, May 23, 1985, financial markets reacted almost instantly. Traders simultaneously sold off U.S. dollar. The yen surged at a dizzying pace. Before the accord, $1 exchanged for about 240 yen. A few months later, by the end of 1985, $1 was worth only 200 yen. By 1987, the exchange rate dropped to 120 yen per dollar. In less than 2 years, the yen's value nearly doubled, creating a real nightmare for Japanese manufacturers. A car that was once profitable in the U.S. market was now being sold at a significant loss due to exchange rate fluctuations. Many factories in Osaka and Nagoya were forced to reduce capacity or shut down, falling into silence. But here comes the crucial turning point. The yen's appreciation would undoubtedly hurt exports. That's undeniable. However, a currency shock in itself doesn't necessarily lead to a massive asset bubble. The gap between pain and loss of control was filled by domestic policy choices. In reality, Japan wasn't entirely backed into a corner at that time. They could have accepted slower growth to restructure or gradually shift focus to domestic consumption. But amid widespread political pressure and fear, the most palatable option was chosen, and that was also the most dangerous option: pumping money to maintain the feeling of growth. The steel and shipbuilding industries quickly felt the pain. The recession caused by the strong yen officially began. Haunted by fears of a Great Depression and a sharp drop in U.S. market demand, the Japanese government fell into a state of panic. They decided to boost spending by injecting massive amounts of money into the economy. The Bank of Japan sharply cut its official discount rate from 5% to a record low of 2.5%. At the same time, they encouraged the banking system to expand lending on a massive scale. This decision, while intended to save the economy, inadvertently triggered a massive financial bomb. The deep interest rate cuts and massive injection of liquidity into the market in 1986 were expected to act as a shield to help the economy weather the recession. But in reality, this policy didn't cool down the economy. Instead, it heated things up even more. Instead of supporting adaptation to a strong yen, cheap money flowed into the most profitable areas, real estate and stocks. The result was an already unbalanced economy being plunged into a widespread speculative frenzy, ushering in a period of financial chaos unprecedented in history. When interest rates remain low for extended periods, money rarely flows into sectors that create sustainable value. Instead, it seeks out the place where it can generate profit most quickly. In Japan at that time, the most attractive things weren't factories or production lines, but land and stocks. The danger lies in the fact that the bubble doesn't burst immediately. In the early years, everything looked like a miracle. Asset prices constantly rising, banks reporting huge profits, businesses becoming wealthy on paper, government collecting more taxes. It was this sense of triumph that caused early warnings to be ignored. When authorities realized things had spiraled out of control, the response often became extreme. Instead of braking early and just enough, they braked late and hard. On a slippery road, braking like that didn't help the car stop safely. It only caused it to flip over. Those were 4 chaotic years when the seemingly certain laws of economics appeared to have lost their validity. An entire nation, caught up in a frenzy of wealth accumulation, gradually lost its footing with reality. This was the bubble era, a period when the massive flow of money through Tokyo became so uncontrollable that it began to distort not only the economy but also the cultural and moral values of Japanese society. The mechanism behind that frenzy is called Zaitech, or financial engineering, a phenomenon that fundamentally changed the way Japanese corporations operated. For decades, names like Toyota, Nissan, and Panasonic were built on their technical strengths and ability to produce high-quality products. But starting around 1986, a dangerous perception gradually formed. Compared to the arduous task of manufacturing goods, making money through finance suddenly became a much more attractive game. When interest rates dropped to record lows, businesses could borrow enormous amounts of capital at virtually negligible costs. Instead of using that capital to build new factories or invest in long-term technological research, they poured the money into stocks and real estate. These speculative investments quickly yielded profits far exceeding income from core production activities, making money far more attractive than producing goods. It became increasingly common for large manufacturing corporations to report that more than half of their annual profits came not from product sales but from financial divisions specializing in buying and selling stocks and bonds. The entire Japanese business sector at that time resembled a giant hedge fund that coincidentally still produced automobiles and electronics. When the market unanimously believed that land prices could only rise, Japanese land quickly transformed into a money-printing machine. Businesses used land as collateral to borrow more capital, used that money to buy more land, causing land prices to continue rising. A self-reinforcing cycle formed in which risk was masked by the upward price momentum itself. It's like someone using their land title to borrow money, buying more land with that money, then using the new land as collateral again. When land prices rose, everyone saw their assets growing, until the day prices reversed. Banks were also caught in that whirlwind. When the value of collateral increased steadily year after year, loans appeared safe on the surface. Risk was pushed into the future, but that future only needed one condition: asset prices stop rising and collapse. From then on, the economy gradually shifted its focus from creating real wealth to inflating wealth on paper. When book value becomes the measure of success, society as a whole begins to trade long-term gains for short-term benefits without realizing it. That massive influx of cheap money inevitably poured into the land market, igniting an irrational real estate boom that defied all common sense. Land prices in Tokyo didn't just increase, they doubled and tripled in just a few months, until valuing the entire city became a meaningless calculation. At the height of the 1989 frenzy, 1 square meter of luxury commercial land in Ginza was valued at over 30 million yen. That means a piece of land the size of a newspaper could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. The estimated total value of all land in Japan, a country roughly the size of California, was 4 times the total value of all land in the United States. This figure implicitly suggests that the barren mountains and rice paddies of rural Japan were, on paper, worth more than the skyscrapers of Manhattan plus the oil fields of Texas and the fertile lands of the American Midwest combined. The most famous figure from this bubble period, which still amazes economists when recalled, is that the Imperial Palace grounds in central Tokyo were once valued higher than the entire real estate market of the state of California. That means, theoretically, the Japanese emperor could simply sell his garden and buy the entire west coast of the United States, with money still left over. This complete disconnect from reality existed not only in balance sheets but gradually spread from the boardrooms of large corporations out onto the streets, transforming the everyday life of Japanese people into a lavish display that transcended all norms. The sudden surge in wealth created a class of people who became rich very quickly. They spent money just as quickly as they earned it. The consequence was a distorted consumer boom where ostentation gradually replaced real value. In the nightclubs of Roppongi, office workers waved 10,000 yen bills to hail taxis without bothering to wait for change. Sushi sprinkled with gold leaf, coffee brewed with gold powder, not for the taste but simply to satisfy the primal sensation of swallowing wealth. Golf club membership cards became the ultimate status symbol, and also a tradable asset. The right to join the most prestigious clubs, like Kagane Country Club, traded for prices exceeding $3.5 million, a sum sufficient to purchase a sprawling mansion in any other country in the world. The art market also experienced a similar situation when Japanese collectors flooded auction houses in London and New York with an insatiable thirst for Western masterpieces. The highlight came in 1990, when Ryoi Saito, chairman of the Daishowa Paper Corporation, purchased Vincent van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet for $82.5 million. Just 2 days later, he bought Renoir's Bal du Moulin de la Galette for $78.1 million. Later, he even nonchalantly declared that he intended to have the paintings cremated along with himself upon his death, so that his descendants would not have to pay inheritance tax. A statement that perfectly encapsulates the nihilistic arrogance of the bubble era. But beneath the glamorous facade of prosperity, the fundamental structure of the Japanese economy was quietly decaying, gnawed away by corruption and the toxic accumulation of bad debt. In a desperate attempt to meet lending targets and keep the flame of growth alive, banks began lending indiscriminately. As long as you could sign a loan agreement and own a piece of land, almost anyone could access credit. Traditional standards of assessment and risk were gradually set aside. They even created loans known as Jubilee, a risky financial instrument where borrowers didn't have to pay either interest or principal for decades. It was all built on a dangerous assumption that land prices would rise forever and that collateral would always be sufficient to cover any debt. The Yakuza, organized crime groups in Japan, gradually became major players in the financial system during the bubble period. Through shell companies, they borrowed billions of yen from legitimate banks and then poured the money into real estate speculation. During that process, threats and the use of violence to force residents out of old neighborhoods became common, paving the way for the rise of glamorous high-rises. The Japanese government and Ministry of Finance also contributed to escalating this disaster by ignoring increasingly clear warning signs. The massive tax revenues from the asset boom masked concerns that the national treasury was overflowing while systemic risks were quietly accumulating beneath the surface. At the same time, many politicians took advantage of insider trading scandals to enrich themselves, a prime example being the recruit case where dozens of high-ranking officials were found to have received pre-listing shares of a personnel company in exchange for political privileges. The party reached its climax on December 29, 1989, the final trading day of the decade. And when the collapse came, it wasn't gradual but a violent explosion, shattering the very foundations of the nation's psyche. Right in the first trading session of 1990, the stock market began to slide and quickly plunged into free fall, wiping out trillions of yen. The value that cheap money once provided, sustaining the illusion of prosperity, suddenly evaporated. By August 1990, the Nikkei index had lost almost half its value. Millions of ordinary people who entered the market at the peak of the bubble witnessed their entire life savings being blown away in a short period of time. The real estate market, which everyone previously believed to be indestructible, followed a similar path, but with a delay that prolonged the pain. Land prices began a deep, slow, and ruthless decline, with final values in some areas plummeting by as much as 80% from their peaks. Balance sheets that once looked perfectly healthy during the asset bubble were now revealing the harsh truth. They were overflowing with toxic materials. Banks were shocked to find they were holding trillions of yen in bad debt secured by assets whose value had almost completely evaporated. In many other countries, when the bubble bursts, the system has to react quickly and decisively. Weak banks are closed or restructured, bad debts are recorded directly in the books, and assets are revalued. The price to pay is painful, but it usually ends sooner. Japan, however, chose a different path of delay and prolongation. Many banks were kept afloat by bailout packages while bad debts piled up year after year. Such organizations are known as zombie banks. They still exist in name, but are no longer able to effectively inject capital into the real economy. When credit becomes stuck in the banking system, businesses lack capital for investment, wages struggle to rise, purchasing power weakens, and deflation becomes a persistent shadow. This is one of the key reasons why Japan's lost decade didn't just last a few years, but stretched across many decades. Considering the human cost of the disaster, this financial blow came quickly and was incredibly harsh. A wave of bankruptcies and suicides swept through the business world, where those who just weeks ago were bosses and pillars of the industry soon lost everything. In a culture that values honor and personal responsibility, the shame associated with failure became a terrible psychological burden, pushing many people to make extreme choices. In late 1991, the chairman of a large restaurant chain embroiled in a financial scandal was found dead in his apartment. Around the same time, news of bank branch managers committing suicide as a way of taking responsibility began to appear more and more frequently, gradually becoming familiar, somber headlines in morning newspapers. Along with that, the illusion of lifelong employment, the social contract that once promised absolute stability in exchange for the absolute loyalty of Japanese workers, also began to crack. When businesses were forced to restructure and lay off employees, the very people who contributed to their success, the fundamental beliefs of an entire generation of workers were shaken. The vibrant energy of the 1980s quickly gave way to a somber, heavy atmosphere of pessimism and caution. Japan entered what are known as the lost decades, a prolonged period of economic stagnation, persistent deflation, and a societal crisis of morale. From being a model of growth that the world was wary of, Japan became a stark warning about the price a nation pays when it advances too quickly, too far, and flies too close to the sun. In addition, there is a subtle but persistent demographic drag. As society ages, the workforce shrinks, young people become more cautious about spending, leading to weakened purchasing power and making it even harder for the economy to escape a cycle of stagnation. After the bubble burst, many young Japanese people began to live more cautiously, reluctant to spend money, reluctant to get married, reluctant to have children. And it is this cautiousness that causes society to age faster and drags the economy further into decline. Corporate structure and workplace culture also contributed to the slow adaptation process. A system accustomed to high and stable growth, when faced with prolonged volatility, often reacts by becoming defensive, cutting costs, withdrawing, and avoiding risk. This slowed down the recovery process and cast a heavy, lingering shadow of pessimism over society. This is not simply a market correction. It's the collapse of a growth model that relies too heavily on exports and asset prices. In this story, the exchange rate shock from the Plaza Accord only served as a spark. But it was the domestic policy responses that fanned the flames, turning it into a disaster. The United States eased pressure from a rising economic rival by manipulating its exchange rate in a way that was unfavorable to Japanese exports. But the path from that shock to the massive bubble and lost decades was not inevitable. It was created through a series of choices made by Japan itself. Prolonged monetary easing, easy credit, lax supervision, and ultimately a sudden break when things spiraled out of control. The consequences of the 1990s, from struggling banks and a generation finding only part-time jobs to persistent anxiety and declining birth rates, can be traced back to the point when the exchange rate shock hit a domestic system already fraught with risks. The story of the Japanese bubble is a chilling reminder that in the world of finance and geopolitics, the line between ally and target is sometimes just a calculation of self-interest. The most dangerous blows don't always come from tanks or missiles. Sometimes they come from agreements ostensibly for stability, signed with seemingly harmless strokes of the pen. The lesson from Japan isn't just about the past. It's a compass for anyone who wants to understand how global power operates, how superpowers protect their interests, and more importantly, how to protect your own assets when the rules of the game change. Because in this world, the greatest danger isn't what you see, but what's signed in silence. If you found this video helpful, please hit like and subscribe to The Global Lens. See you in the next video, where we continue to decode the power plays that shape our world.